This video continues the story of Michael Merzenich and how his accidental breakthrough in an experiment led to an evolution in how neuroscience is thought of, how neuroscientists thought about how the brain worked and understood that the brain is capable of change. In today's video, we're going to look at what happened after Merzenich made his breakthrough discovery. Did the world of science rally around him and cheer and shout and applaud his work and really gather around his concept of brain plasticity? Or did they do the opposite? Did they say, no, you're wrong. What you think you've discovered is not what you've actually discovered. The brain is fixed and the brain is not plastic. And what did Merzenich do with the response he got? So this video is going to look at what happened immediately after his breakthrough discovery, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the experiments that he had to look at going back in time to see had anybody else actually went against the prevailing view of science at the time that the brain was hardwired and that this movement of localizationism, as it was called, was perhaps wrong, and perhaps mainstream science at the time had all misunderstood how the brain worked. And if that was pointed out to them, would they actually accept it? Let's find out. Hi, it's Peter here from 5 Minute Brain Hacks. In our last video, we were looking at the book from Norman Doidge. The book was called The Brain That Changes Itself. And we were looking at some work from Michael Merzenich and the question of, is the brain plastic or is it hardwired at birth? So in that previous video, we looked at the work of Merzenich and how he accidentally discovered that the brain in fact was plastic and that it's not hardwired at birth. We showed in the video that the accidental breakthrough came when Merzenich and his team were looking at the mysterious interaction between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And as a result of that breakthrough, they discovered that the brain is in fact plastic and it's not hardwired. He also observed that the new topographical areas were forming in slightly different places than before. Topographical means that the areas adjacent to each other on the body's surface are adjacent to each other in brain maps. So there's two very important points here. The first one is Merzenich and his team had just made a really significant breakthrough, a significant discovery. And the first question was, what would they do with that discovery? The second question was the prevailing thought at the time within the scientific world about the brain and how it worked, and how they were essentially going to be fighting against the view that permeated through all of neuroscience at the time, that the brain was hardwired, that you couldn't change it, and that what you had from adolescence is the brain that you have right until you die. And Merzenich had just found that that wasn't the case. The brain is plastic and capable of change. So what did he do? What was the first steps after he actually discovered and made that massive breakthrough? So up to the discovery of Merzenich, the prevailing thought at the time was called localizationism, and that view held that different parts of the brain process different mental functions and that they stay the same, they don't change. Merzenich's view on the result of his breakthrough experiment was that the localizationism view was either incorrect or just plain wrong. So what did Merzenich do? Well, he sought out initially to see, had anybody made similar breakthroughs before? Was there any scientific literature available at the time that actually contradicted the localization view that the brain was hardwired? So the first piece of work that Merzenich came across was from work done in 1912 by Graham Brown and Charles Sherrington. And they found that stimulating one point in the motor cortex might cause an animal to bend its knee at one point and move it in a totally different way at another point. This experiment was lost to scientific literature and seemed to show that there was no point-to-point relationship between the brain's motor map and specific movements. Merzenich continued his search through historical scientific literature and came across another experiment from 1923. Karl Lashley ran an experiment using much cruder equipment than microelectrodes. He exposed the motor cortex of a monkey's brain. He then stimulated it in a particular place and watched the resulting movement. He then sewed the monkey back up. After a period of time, he repeated the experiment, stimulating the monkey in the same spot. only to find that the movement produced often changed. Harvard's Edwin G Boring, the great historian of psychology at the time, said, "One day's mapping would no longer be valid on the morrow." Brain maps were clearly dynamic. Merzenich now had historical scientific evidence to back up his own scientific evidence, and he rightly saw the immense implications of these experiments. He then spoke to Vernon Mountcastle, a localizationist, about the Lashley experiment. In his own words, Merzenich said that Mountcastle's view was he was actually bothered by the Lashley experiment. Mountcastle did not instinctively want to believe in plasticity. He wanted things to be in their place forever. And Mountcastle knew that this experiment represented an important challenge to how you think about the brain. Mountcastle thought that Lashley was an extravagant exaggerator. At the time, the neuroscience community were willing to accept Hubel and Wiesel's discovery that plasticity exists in infancy because they accepted that the infant brain was in the midst of development. But they rejected Merzenich's view that plasticity continues into adulthood. Hubel and Wiesel in the 1960s discovered that the brain in very young animals is plastic. They were micromapping the visual cortex of how using vision is processed. They inserted microelectrodes into the visual cortex of kittens and discovered that different parts of the cortex processed the lines, orientation and movements of visually perceived objects. They also discovered that there was a critical period from the 3rd to the 8th week of life when the new kitten's brain had to receive visual stimulation in order to develop normally. In the crucial experiment, Hubel and Wiesel sewed one eyelid shut of the kitten during its critical period, so the eye got no visual stimulation. When they opened this shut eye, they found that the visual areas in the brain map that normally process input from the shut eye had failed to develop, leaving the kitten blind in that eye for life. Clearly, the brain of kittens during the critical period were plastic, their structure literally shaped by experience. When Hubel and Wiesel examined the brain map of the blind eye, they made more unexpected discoveries about brain map and plasticity. Part of the kitten brain that had been deprived of input from the shut eye did not remain idle. It had begun to process visual input from the open eye, as though the brain didn't want to waste any cortical real estate, and had found a way to rewire itself. Another indication that the brain is plastic in the critical period. For this work, Hubel and Wiesel received a Nobel. Yet even though they had discovered brain plasticity in infancy, they remained localizationists, defending the idea that the adult brain is hardwired by the end of infancy to perform functions in fixed locations. Merzenich said at this point, "I had all these reasons why I wanted to believe that the brain wasn't plastic in this way, and they were thrown over in a week." Merzenich now had to find his mentors from the ghosts of dead scientists like Sherrington and Lashley. He wrote a paper on the shuffled nerve experiment, and in the discussion section he argued for several pages that the adult brain is plastic, though he didn't use that word. But the discussion was never published. Clinton Woolsey, his supervisor, wrote a big X across it, saying it was too conjectural and that Merzenich was going way beyond the data. When the paper was published, no mention was made of plasticity, and only minimal emphasis was given to explaining the new topographical organisation. Merzenich backed down from the opposition, at least in print. He was still, after all, a postdoc working in another man's lab. Understanding brain plasticity and its origins are critical to understanding the potential of the brain, your brain that you have today. This is why we're going back and looking at the work of Michael Merzenich and his experiment that made his initial breakthrough, but also the experiments of people before him. And we're up to a point now in the early 1970s where Merzenich has completed his formal education. He's written his doctorate and his thesis, not specifically calling out the word plasticity and backing down from his peers and scientific opinion at the time that brain plasticity really only existed in infancy, and by the time people became adults, the brain was fixed, it was hardwired, and there was no plasticity. If you think about the potential of the human brain today and what people can do, it's critical to understand the journey from where we were with a hardwired view of the world to today where we know that the brain is, as we have said before, like a living creature. If it's treated in the right way and it's fed the right type of exercise and food, it will grow and develop. And it is really, there are no limits on the brain in terms of the plasticity and how it can actually develop. And this leads to your potential. So it is a bit theoretical at the moment in terms of what we're looking at and what we're talking about, but it's critical to understand and to believe in the plasticity of the brain, to understand what it is to be plastic, to understand what it means that your brain is capable of changing depending on what you do, your actions on the day-to-day basis. If you understand a bit of the evolution of how we got from hardwired to the brain is plastic, if you understand that journey and listen to how they did the experiments over the period from 1912 up to where we are at the moment, we're going to be moving on from this over the next few weeks and looking at more of the evolution of how Merzenich and his teams understood more and more about plasticity in the brain and how this comes back to how you think on a day-to-day basis and how you can maximize the potential of your brain. So you might hear a lot of people talking about the power of the brain and various exercises you can do with the brain. But if you don't really understand, in my opinion, if you don't understand how the brain actually works and the evolution from a hardwired mindset to a plastic mindset, if you don't really understand that, you may not believe fully in brain plasticity because you don't understand how it works. The purpose of these videos is to really go through the history of science from the hardwired mindset to the brain is plastic, is malleable, is capable of change, extraordinary change. If you understand that evolution, you understand the biology piece of it, in my opinion, you're much more likely to believe in your own ability to change how you think and improve how you think and improve your observation, improve everything around your senses, your hearing, your sight, your feel, your touch, your smell. You can improve all of those senses through training and the various thinking capabilities as well, observation and thinking. You can improve all of those, but it helps tremendously if you actually understand the science beneath that, the foundation that all of these modern day principles and theories are built on. So next week we're going to continue on with the book The Brain That Changed Itself from Norman Doidge. It's filled with practical insights into the experiments and the work of Merzenich and how he has built up that increasingly sophisticated view of how the brain works through his work. So that's it for today. I hope you got some value from it again. As I said, there are no quick fixes here. There are no quick wins. That's probably the number one brain hack that you should take. There are no quick fixes. It's like building momentum brick by brick and building an understanding brick by brick. And one day you look back and you have this amazing wall built, and you believe in your own ability to make the change that you want to believe in. So if you've liked the video, please comment or subscribe. If you want to talk about brain plasticity, I'd love to hear your comments about it, how you've found brain plasticity working in your own life, how you maybe changed how you're thinking. But I'm especially interested in your beliefs in terms of, do you understand how the brain is plastic? Do you understand in brain plasticity? Do you understand in your ability to actually improve how you think? Based on knowing that your brain is capable of massive, massive positive change. And then, if you want to hear more of these videos, please subscribe. So that's it for today. Thanks for listening. Bye.